I will begin from this describing radiation processes that produce continuum radiation. We already saw that an accelerated charge emits radiation. And we have also seen that it's a collection of such radiation from multiple charges, which produces the net radiation from any given source. So we will now go through some processes which sort of employ these two aspects of electromagnetic radiation to describe different continuum radiation processes. The underlying mechanism in every single case is an accelerated charge emitting radiation, and a collection of those put together is the total radiation that you see from the source. Only the source of acceleration could be different in different cases. So let's begin. Next slide, please. So the first process that I will describe is called Bremsstrahlung. The Bremsstrahlung is a German word which which means braking radiation. So if you have a charge and if you brake its motion or accelerate it, then it produces radiation. Now this is the same process that you have an electron which in the presence of another charged particle like proton will experience acceleration, and that acceleration will cause its trajectory to bend or speed up or slow down, and because of that acceleration it will produce emission. Now Bremsstrahlung specifically talks about situations where the electron is not bound to the ion to begin with, and after the radiation has taken place, which means it has lost some energy, it is still in a free state. So it is still not bound. So this often therefore goes by the name free emission. So electron is free in the beginning, free after the emission is done. So as you can see in the left-hand corner, upper left-hand corner of the figure, we have an electron passing by a proton with an impact parameter, let's call that B. And that causes the electron trajectory to bend, and this acceleration causes radiation, as you have seen before. If you look at the electric field that the observer receives as a function of time, and then take a look at the Fourier transform of it, then what you see is the lower left-hand diagram over here. So that gives you the spectrum of this radiation that has been generated. Clearly, the electric field that you receive is most intense when the electron is closest to the proton, and it drops off as it passes by and goes to further distances. And it is also small before it approaches the proton within, let us say, a distance b or so. So it's a radiation that is confined in time, the electric field that is confined in time, and the Fourier transform also reflects that. So there are two components of it. One is parallel to the motion and is perpendicular to the motion. And these two components produce these two curves, which you can see on the left-hand side. So the maximum of the emission is around this quantity. So the total time of encounter is the scale is about the impact parameter b divided by the speed of the electron, that is v. If the electron is moving relativistically, then you have to multiply factor gamma to that, so it is b by gamma v, and the characteristic frequency of emission will be inverse of that. So you can see that it is the characteristic frequency gamma v by b which sort of limits the extent of the emission that you get from this electron. So this is in a single encounter. Now, the electron has the probability of encountering a charged particle with many different values of B. And because of that possibility, the emission from a single electron itself can come at different frequencies. So it's a whole range of frequencies, which is governed by the allowable values of B. So we can then look at the probability of this encounter. We can look at the probability of this encounter as a function of B, and then average the spectrum. And then all this is for a given electron velocity V. And then we can, in a medium, there are electrons with a whole range of values of velocity. For example, if it is a thermal source, electrons have Maxwellian distribution of velocity. So you have to take the velocity distribution and integrate it over that as well. So there are these two integrations which need to be done. One is averaging over B, and other is the integrating over the velocity distribution. And that will then give you the full spectrum from a given source. Most common sources from which we do see this Bremsstrahlung emission in astrophysical situation are thermal sources, which means the velocity distribution of electrons is given by a Maxwellian of a given temperature. So if we take the spectrum as I described in the previous slide and use Maxwellian velocity of, distribution of the electrons to sum it, then we can get the total spectrum that the source produces. And typically, the spectrum is going to look like this blue line, which is shown over here. The blue line is a thermal Bremsstrahlung spectrum for a given temperature. And I have compared that with a possible blackbody spectrum at that temperature. Now, you would have remembered from the radiative transfer equation that the blackbody is the source function of any thermal source, and it represents the net emission that the source will produce when optical depth is infinity, which means it is the maximum possible radiation that the source can produce. If optical depth is less than infinity, then the total emission will be less than the blackbody emission. So this is what you see here, that when you come to low frequencies, the emission sort of hugs the blackbody curve, which means the optical depth is high over there. And as the frequency increases, optical depth becomes lower, and at some point the source becomes optically thin, and the net emission drops below the blackbody curve. So I've mentioned on the left-hand side the dependence of the emission coefficient and the absorption coefficient on the important quantities that are relevant. So both emission coefficient and absorption coefficient is proportional to the atomic charge of the ions, that is proportional to z squared. It is proportional to number density of electrons, Ne, and it is also proportional to the number density of ions, Ni. So z squared Ne Ni is the common factor in the emission and absorption coefficients. And both these coefficients have a leading temperature dependence, which goes as t to the power minus half. And then the emission coefficient drops as e to the power minus h nu by kt. So when h nu is much smaller than kt, then the j nu is sort of has a high value, because e to the power minus h nu by kt when h nu is very small is close to 1. But as h nu approaches kt and then goes above, it drops exponentially. And that is the drop on the right-hand side of the thermal Bremsstrahlung blue curve that you see. So that is dictated by JNU. And the optical depth is dictated by the absorption coefficient, which has 1 minus e to the power of minus h nu by kt, but it also has this factor nu to the power of minus 3. So that is frequency to the power of minus 3. So as you go to lower frequencies, the absorption coefficient rises rapidly. And that is why at low enough frequencies, it becomes optically thick. And the emission will then hug the blackbody curve. So this is a typical description of a thermal Bremsstrahlung spectrum. Depending on the size of the source, the density of the source, the temperature, and so on, the exact point of where it becomes optically thick and so on will be decided. And different sources have different range of frequencies over which this happens. Next slide, please. So I said this is an emission from a thermal plasma. You have electrons and ions, so ionized plasma, which produces Bremsstrahlung. Such plasma also produces continuum in some other ways. One is a free electron can get captured by a proton or an ion which is present and then form a bound state. Now, since the initial state is a free state, which means it could have any energy, while the final state is a defined state in a quantum state of the atom. But since the initial state is free, this produces radiation at arbitrary values of energy, at arbitrary values of photon frequency. So this also produces continuum. It is just that both ends are not free. It's free at one end, but is bound at the other. There is also a process which is a higher order process, and it produces lower quantities of emission, and so that is called a two-photon continuum. So it is a transition between two bound states, but the transition happens not using one photon, but using two photons. And since the boundary of the energy at which these two photons will split is arbitrary, so this also produces a continuum radiation. So in the right-hand side, I've shown a typical expected spectrum from a hot ionized astrophysical plasma at 10 million degrees Kelvin. And you can see the blue line above, at the top is the Bremsstrahlung, which is the dominant emission, certainly at energies typically lower than kT. And then there are these other processes, the recombination, which is shown in green line, and the two-photon continuum in red line, which also contribute to the total emission. Plus, there are bound transitions which produce spectral lines, so which are shown on top with the different species labeled. So this is a typical spectrum that you will see from a hot ionized astrophysical plasma. Most of the continuum is generated by Bremsstrahlung, although there are these other sources of continuum radiation. Here are some examples of copious thermal free emitters. The ionized hydrogen regions where there is a hot star which is ionizing the interstellar gas around it is a common source of free emission, particularly at radio wavelengths that can be quite bright. And then supernova remnants, which produces a very high speed shock, and then this shock then ionizes the material it is moving through, which is the interstellar medium. And this hot material also produces X-ray emission by free radiation. And there are, of course, several other examples. I'm just giving you two randomly chosen examples for Bremsstrahlung. So we will leave Bremsstrahlung over here and go to the next process. The next source of acceleration an electron can experience in astrophysical setting is the presence of a magnetic field. So in the case of Bremsstrahlung, the acceleration was produced by the electric field of another charge. But here, the acceleration is provided by the Lorentz force that a magnetic field exerts on an electron. So if you have a magnetic field and then let us say the electron is moving perpendicular to it, then the electron will execute a circular motion. And if the electron has a component of velocity along the magnetic field, then it will execute a helical motion. So if the electron is moving slowly, that is its speed is much less than the speed of light, then this motion, the circular motion or the helical motion, has a well-defined frequency, and this frequency is called the cyclotron frequency. The value of it is 3 megahertz per Gauss. So if there's 1 Gauss magnetic field, then an electron gyrating and producing this radiation, which we call cyclotron radiation, has the cyclotron frequency of 3 megahertz in the 1 Gauss magnetic field. The typical magnetic field in interstellar space could be as low as microgauss to a nanogauss. So the electron producing cyclotron frequency in these kind of low magnetic fields would produce rather low frequency radiation. So let us take a microgauss field, and if you have an electron producing a cyclotron radiation in there, you would have a frequency which is of the order of 3 hertz, which is actually not observable by us because the interstellar space, because of its plasma frequency, absorbs radiation below a certain value of frequency. But this process, even in interstellar space and even in such low magnetic fields, can produce copious amounts of emission if the electron is moving very fast. That is, if the electron is velocity is relativistic with a large Lorentz factor. And if the Lorentz factor is high, then as you know, 2 things happen. One is the frequency gets Doppler boosted, as well as there is a strong beaming factor that takes effect. In that limit, this radiation is called synchrotron radiation. Now here what happens is that in this right-hand diagram, I have shown a part of an orbit of an electron. And because of the strong relativistic motion, the electric field is now beamed very strongly in the forward direction of the motion of the electron. So as the electron moves in this orbit, this electric field, the radiation field, points in the direction of the velocity of the electron. Now, if your line of sight happens to be along this vector k, which is shown here, then this emission cone will enter and exit the line of sight in a short span of time. So unlike low velocity electrons, the electron moving in a circular orbit and producing sinusoidal electric field, you would now see an electric field which is strongly peaked in time, and then it's very low for most of the rest of the time. So it's a very short duty cycle. A schematic is shown at the bottom in the bottom right. So because of this peaked nature of the electric field, once you Fourier transform this, you would have not only the fundamental frequency of repetition of this electric field, which is equal to the gyro frequency, but it will have many, many higher harmonics because of the very sharp nature of this electric field pulse. And when you look at the distribution of the intensities of these harmonics, then you will get a distribution which is shown in the left-hand the bottom diagram over there. So it rises, it achieves a peak, and then it goes down. And the peak happens to be nearly at Lorentz factor cubed times the gyro frequency. Now the gyro frequency itself, when the Lorentz factor is high, goes down by a factor of gamma from the cyclotron frequency, as I mentioned before, 3 megahertz per Gauss. So gyro frequency omega h itself is the cyclotron frequency over gamma, but the peak of this emission is at gamma cubed times the gyro frequency. So the frequency at which it peaks is proportional to gamma squared times the cyclotron frequency. Cyclotron frequency is a fixed number for an electron, which is 3 megahertz per Gauss. So the peak frequency here then would be 0.8 gamma squared megahertz for an electron in a 1 Gauss field. So as you can see, now with gamma of some substantial values of gamma, let's say 100 to 1000 to million, you can start producing the peak emission at high frequencies, high and observable frequencies. The power radiated by an electron is proportional to the square of the Lorentz factor as well. So the expression at the bottom line shows you the power, which is 4/3 times sigma t is the Thomson cross section, which is a fundamental constant, times c, which is again a fundamental constant. Beta is the velocity of the electron, speed of the electron in units of speed of light. But since it is very relativistic, beta is very close to 1. So beta squared is almost equal to 1. Then Lorentz factor squared, and then is the magnetic energy density, which is proportional to b squared over 8 pi. So the power is proportional to square of the magnetic field and square of the Lorentz factor. The frequency is proportional to square of the Lorentz factor and linear power of the magnetic field. So that is how the dependence of synchrotron emission goes for a single electron. Now, of course, like in every case, a source will have many electrons, each with a different value of velocity and therefore a different value of Lorentz factor. So to get the total emission from a source, we will have to integrate over the energy distribution of electrons. So these are some examples of sources which produce powerful synchrotron emission. On the left, I have shown two pictures of the Crab Nebula, a radio picture above and X-ray picture below, both of which are produced by synchrotron emission from relativistic particles in the nebula. And on the right-hand side, I have shown the picture of a very large radio galaxy, well-known radio galaxy called Cygnus A, where there are relativistic particles being pumped from the central source, which is you see as a small bright point, through large jets, and these jets then interact with the surrounding intergalactic medium and produce this large blobs of synchrotron radiation called the lobes, which are the brightest points that you see in this picture. So all of this is synchrotron emission. So if you look at the spectrum of these sources, it is very clear that the particle energy distribution in these sources, so particle energies which get to relativistic regime require some kind of acceleration process to create the particles with such high energy. And these acceleration processes generally produce an energy distribution which is a power law, which means the number of particles as a function of gamma, n of gamma, is proportional to gamma to the power of minus p, where p is a power law index. Now, if you have a particle energy distribution like that, and we know that for synchrotron, the typical frequency goes as gamma squared, and typical power also goes as gamma squared. So taking this into account, we can integrate this over this particle energy distribution, and we find that the emission coefficient becomes proportional to nu to the power of minus p minus 1 by 2. So if the source is optically thin, then the spectrum that you will see will be the same as what the dependence of emission coefficient on frequency is like. So you will get a optically thin frequency part of the emission where it is also a power law with a slope of minus p minus 1 by 2. Now, if you look at the absorption coefficient of this material, then that has a dependence of nu to the minus p plus 4 by 2. So therefore, the source function for this kind of power law distribution has a frequency dependence which is proportional to nu to the power of 5 halves. So if you look at the consequences of all this, then as you can see, as you go to lower and lower frequencies, at some point, the source may become optically thick. And if the source becomes optically thick, the nu to the power of minus p minus 1 by 2 spectrum will then transform into a spectrum where the slope is equal to the source function. And here the source function is not a black body, but it has a slope of nu to the power of plus 2.5. And it's the dashed line which shows the optically thick part of the emission. If the source happens to become optically thick at this point where this dashed line intersects the solid line. Above that frequency, you will have this nu to the power of minus p minus 1 by 2 spectrum. However, if you keep going to higher and higher frequencies, as you can see that the emission rate, energy loss rate from an electron is proportional to Lorentz factor squared, whereas the total energy content of the electron is proportional to Lorentz factor. So above a certain frequency, the energy loss rate of the electrons will become overwhelming, and the electrons will lose their energy very, very quickly and become tired. And in that regime, if you start with original power law spectrum of nu to the minus p minus 1 by 2, or particle energy spectrum proportional to e to gamma to the power of minus p, and you keep injecting such spectra, then above this energy where the cooling dominates, you will get a modified energy distribution of electrons because of excessive loss of energy. And it steepens the energy distribution index by 1, so it becomes gamma to the power of minus p plus 1, and that reflects in the radiation spectrum as nu to the power of minus p by 2. And this frequency where the power law steepens is known as the break frequency or cooling frequency. And if you are dealing with radio sources, you would often use this break to determine the age of a source, because as the age progresses, more and more electrons become tired, and this frequency keeps moving down in value. Now, there are other possibilities of the low energy part of the spectrum. If this spectrum did not become optically thick at the point where I have shown, where the dashed line joins the solid line, but if the power law of distribution of energies has a lower cutoff, then there will be a corresponding frequency corresponding to the lower cutoff in energy. And if the emission has not become optically thick by then, below that frequency, you will have a nu to the power of plus 1/3 dependence of emission. And if the optical thickness, high optical thickness comes well below that frequency, then the slope of that optically thick regime becomes plus 2 and not plus 2.5, because at that point, since there are no electrons for which the characteristic energy is in that regime, the source function there is similar to that of a black body, and the black body function at low frequencies goes as near to the power of +2. So both these +2 or this +2.5 go by the name synchrotron self-absorption. And there is another process of electron in a magnetic field which can produce radiation. In synchrotron radiation, as I said, that the electron gyrates around the magnetic field, and it is that motion of gyration which produces the synchrotron radiation we see. However, if the magnetic field is very strong and the energy of the electron perpendicular to the magnetic field has been practically radiated away, so then the electron will move along the magnetic field. Now, if the magnetic field happens to be curved, then this curvature also then produces an acceleration to the electron, because the electron is forced to move along the curved magnetic field. And this will also produce radiation because of that acceleration. And this is called curvature radiation. The properties of this radiation are very similar to the synchrotron radiation. Only thing, the radius of curvature of the gyrating synchrotron path, which is called the Larmor radius, has now to be replaced by the radius of curvature of the field line itself. And once you do that, the description is very similar to that of the synchrotron radiation. And this curvature radiation is very important in the magnetospheres of very strongly magnetized objects like pulsars. So the next continuum emission process I would like to mention is of scattering. Now, you have a photon and an electron interacting, and after the interaction, you again get a photon and an electron, but there could be an energy exchange between the two. If the photon happens to be of very high energy and the electron is not so high energy, then the photon can transfer some energy to the electron, speed up the electron, and the photon will lose its energy. And in the other extreme, if the photon is of low energy and electron is moving very fast, then some of the kinetic energy of the electron can be transferred to the low energy photon, and it can become a high energy photon. So this is called Compton scattering. And in the process in which a low energy photon is converted to high energy photon is called an inverse Compton scattering. And this inverse Compton scattering, of course, generates radiation energy in the system. And so it comes as a part of radiative process. So the regime in which the energy transfer between the incoming and the outgoing photon is very low is called the Thomson scattering, which is called the elastic limit. So where the photon and the electron typically retain their energies, but there is a change in direction. This process can be described as an electron. Let us say we are in the rest frame of the electron, and there is a incoming electric field with incoming radiation with an electric field shown with these red arrows. So let's say it is oscillating along the vectors shown there. So that will accelerate the electron to move along these blue vectors which are shown. Now, once this electron is accelerated, of course, an observer will then see a component of the acceleration, and hence it will see a radiation electric field. So this observer, which is shown here, sees the projected part of this acceleration, which is shown in small red arrows, and the observer will see electromagnetic radiation. And this is the scattering process, and this is a typical description of Thomson scattering. So in the Thomson limit, the scattering cross-section is given by this fundamental constant 8 pi by 3 e squared by mec squared. So when the incoming photon energy is much lower than the rest energy of the electron, then the scattering is mostly in the Thomson regime. So you have the cross section, which is plotted on the vertical axis here, and frequency in units of frequency as the electron sees it, in units of the rest energy of the electron. so when that value is very low, then the cross section is high. It is close to Thomson scattering cross section. However, as the photon energy increases, the cross section drops. So this is the Compton scattering cross section, also known as Klein-Mishina cross section. So in the Thomson limit, what we have is a high efficiency of scattering, and the energy transfer in scattering is very small. So it's more or less elastic scattering. So if we are sitting on the electron, the incoming photon and the outgoing photon has the same energy. Now, we are going to talk about situations where the electron is moving at high speeds with respect to the observer. So to describe this process, then we can go to the instantaneous rest frame of the electron. So now let us take a radiation field which the observer sees, and there is a electron which the observer sees to move. Let us go to the rest frame of the electron. Then what we will see is the ambient radiation field is now Doppler shifted, because now we have moved to a frame which is moving with high speed, and its frequency as seen by the electron is now boosted by the Lorentz factor. So let's take nu I as the the initial frequency of the photon as seen in the lab frame. Nu prime is the frequency of the same photon as seen by the electron. So nu I to nu prime has a ratio of 1:, gamma. Now, in the rest frame of the electron, the transformed frequency of the photon could still be in the regime where h2 is much less than MEC squared. So it will undergo Thomson scattering. And it will undergo Thomson scattering. So the scattered photon in the rest frame of the electron will still have a frequency nu prime, but this photon will now be given a momentum largely in the direction of motion of the electron as seen in the lab frame. So now if you take that photon, which is now moving in the direction in which the electron was moving, and then transform that frequency back to the lab frame, then it picks up another factor of gamma. So between nu prime to nu f is another factor of gamma. So therefore, sitting in the lab frame, what we will see is that an electron of Lorentz factor gamma scattered a photon of frequency nu I and produced a frequency nu f, which is gamma squared times nu I. So therefore, the typical frequency that the output inverse Compton scattering will produce is proportional to the Lorentz factor squared of the electron. And so this is similar to what synchrotron radiation also did. The frequency was proportional to Lorentz factor squared. And interestingly, such similarity also exists in the expression for power. I have already mentioned to you the synchrotron power is equal to 4/3 sigma T C beta squared gamma squared energy density in the magnetic field. The Compton power is practically the same, with the energy density in the magnetic field replaced by the energy density in the photon field. All the other factors are the same, so this is also proportional to Lorentz factor squared. So both in frequency and in power, the Compton process has the same dependence on gamma as synchrotron. So therefore, if you have a polar distribution of particles, particle energy distribution, then Compton also will produce a similar nu to the power of p minus 1/2 spectrum. Now, there are many sources where you have magnetic field, you have these highly relativistic particles, and these highly relativistic particles moving in the magnetic field produce a synchrotron radiation field. And these highly relativistic particles then scatter the same synchrotron radiation field in a Compton process and produce a high frequency Compton power. So this is called a synchrotron self-Compton process. And you can get in the spectrum two humps like this. The first hump is comes from the synchrotron process, and this synchrotron process then provides seed photon for the Compton process, and this Compton process then boosts these by gamma squared and produces a second hump, as you can see in the spectrum. And if you do find sources where the spectra does exhibit this kind of distribution, then this gives you an interesting way to determine the Lorentz factor of the material over there, typical Lorentz factor of the material over there, because the Compton peak will be at Lorentz factor squared times the synchrotron peak. And this is actually an observed spectrum of one of the blazar sources, which is also a very strong radio emitter. So I will leave the continuum radiation processes over there. I'll go to line radiation processes now. There are, of course, the line radiation process relates to an electron transiting between two bound states. And the characteristic energies of these bound states are specific to the species. It could be the atom, it could be the molecule, which produces this radiation. So therefore, this radiation carries valuable information regarding the physical state, composition, dynamics, and all of this of the matter. Now, let us take two states, 1 and 2, as shown here, and let the population of electrons in these two states be N1 and N2. Then there are processes which connect these two states, which are the following. If there is a photon of frequency equal to h nu, which is equal to the energy difference between these two states, then that incident photon could be absorbed, and that probability is given by an Einstein coefficient called B12, that is going from state 1 to state 2. And the number of such occurrences per unit time will be equal to N1, where N1 is the population per unit volume, or the population in the source in state 1, and B12, which is the probability, and I nu is the incident intensity. So N1, B12, I nu is the rate at which the upper state will be populated from the lower state because of the incident radiation. So this results in absorption of the incident radiation. Now, there's also this process where electron in state 2 can make a spontaneous radiative transition to state 1 and create a photon of frequency nu, which is equal to delta E by h. So this spontaneous emission process is the emission process that we know about. However, the incident radiation can also induce transitions between state 2 to state 1. This is called stimulated emission. So that process has a rate equal to N2 times the incident intensity of the photon, and this coefficient B21, which is going from state 2 to state 1. Now, these terms can be gathered to express our familiar emission coefficient and absorption coefficient. So emission coefficient is simply the number of such transitions per unit time, which is number of spontaneous radiative transitions per unit time, which is proportional to N2 times the probability A21 times the energy carried by each such transition, h nu. And since j nu happens to be per unit solid angle, you divide it by 4 pi. So it is h nu by 4 pi into A21 is the emission coefficient j nu. And the absorption coefficient alpha nu is related to the processes that interact with the incident radiation, and that is absorption and stimulated emission. So alpha nu is actually h nu by 4 pi times n1 b12 minus n2 b21. Now there could be situations where n2 b21 is larger than n1 b12. In that case, the absorption coefficient can become negative. So then any incident radiation I nu will then be amplified, because any I nu will then be added to primarily by stimulated emission. And this is called maser emission or laser emission. For this, one has to create this population inversion by which n2 b21 becomes larger than n1 b12. So if such a population inversion does take place, then you can see maser amplification of incident radiation. And surprisingly, in astronomy, nature produces this kind of population inversion in numerous different situations. And that is primarily due to first excitation by ambient radiation, and then recombination into the atomic or molecular states, where the recombination gets populated from the upper states, and then they slowly come down, and upper states can see a higher population because of this radiative excitation process and photoexcitation, photoionization process and recombination process. So I'll briefly mention some of the most important spectral lines for astronomical purposes. Of course, every spectral line is very important because it carries a lot of information about the source, about the composition, about the origin of the species that that exist in the source, and so on. So no line is to be discounted, but some lines have found more use in multiple ways than others. And one of them is this hyperfine transition of hydrogen, which is called H1 21 centimeter line. And this comes in the radio band. And this is one of the most prominent spectral lines in the radio band, where in a hydrogen atom, the electron and the proton, if they make a transition from parallel spin to anti-parallel spin, then energy difference occurs and a photon is emitted. And that photon has this frequency of 1420 megahertz or a wavelength of 21 centimeter. Since hydrogen is highly abundant in the universe, this line happens to be one of the strongest lines that one can see both in emission and in appropriate situation in absorption. And it helps us map the dynamics of gas in galaxies and in some cases in the intergalactic medium. In fact, the entire rotation of our galaxy and many other galaxies are determined by looking at the Doppler shift of this line as a function of position. So this is a very, very important line for astronomical diagnostics. And since hydrogen is abundant, when you go to ultraviolet, another very strong line that you would see from hydrogen is the Lyman alpha line. The Lyman alpha line occurs all over the universe. And in fact, clouds of hydrogen, wherever they exist, they can absorb very efficiently the incoming radiation at Lyman alpha frequencies. And this is an interesting way of observing distribution of hydrogen gas along the line of sight to a very distant object. For example, let's take a quasar. A quasar produces a continuum emission over a large range of wavelengths. Now, the quasar could be sitting very far away from us, and in between the quasar and us, there are many, many hydrogen clouds, which include galaxies and so on. But since these different clouds are at different distances from us, each of them is at a different redshift. So the rest frequency of Lyman alpha at each of these clouds appear at different observed frequencies for us. So all along the quasar spectrum, you would see these various absorption lines, which are all Lyman alpha absorption, but by clouds sitting at different redshifts. And this gives us a very nice way to determine the distribution of hydrogen all along the line of sight. It's been a very highly researched and highly valued piece of information. This is called Lyman alpha forest, and it's helped us understanding the structures in intergalactic medium in a very detailed manner. Another important line, which is used often in X-ray astronomy, is the iron K alpha line. So this iron K alpha line occurs when the innermost electron in the iron atom gets knocked off, and then the electron from a higher state drops into that vacant space and produces this line. So that's the iron K alpha line. So this iron K alpha line has a frequency of about 6 kV. The profile of this iron K alpha line can tell us about the Doppler shifts in the material that is producing this. So the material that produces this needs to be very hot, and typically this is found from material accreting close to compact objects like black holes or neutron stars and so on. And particularly for black holes, this is important because the iron K alpha line, since it originates from the inner edge of the accretion disk, inner edge of the accretion flow, circulating accretion flow, it can tell us how close to the black hole the inner edge of the accretion flow extends. If the black hole is spinning very fast, then the accretion flow, the circular accretion flow can approach the black hole to much closer distance than if it is not spinning. And in fact, it is by looking at this profile of iron K alpha line, the spin of the accreting black holes are now routinely being measured. So this is again a very important diagnostic, provides a very important diagnostic of astrophysical sources. So I will leave the electronic radiation processes over there and just wind up by mentioning a couple of other processes which also contribute to emission that we see. This includes nuclear processes like radioactivity. So nucleus transmutes and produces gamma radiation. For example, aluminum-26 produces 1.8 MeV radiation that's quite widespread in galaxies. So any radioactive nuclide which is produced will generate gamma radiation of this kind. Now, the diffuse gamma emission that we see in most of the sky comes primarily from decay of heavy mesons. For example, the pi0 meson decaying into 2 photons. And the pi0 mesons get generated in nuclear scattering. For example, 2 protons can interact with each other and produce a pi0 meson. And this pi0 meson then decays and produce 2 gamma photons. And this is a copious contributor to the diffuse gamma ray emission that is observed. If you directly see nuclear fusion going on anywhere, for example, sometimes you see in hot accretion flow, direct fusion, then you would see gamma rays directly from those fusion as well. Pair annihilation is also a possible source of emission. So this produces 511 keV pair annihilation line, that is electron-positron pairs generated by some accelerating object, then the electron-positron pairs can annihilate and produce a 511 keV line. There are sources like that near our galactic center. Then you can have possible source of emission from some forms of dark matter. So we don't know what dark matter is composed of yet. So this is yet a speculation that some forms of dark matter, if they do occur, then you can observe decay of this dark matter producing a gamma radiation. And people have been looking for it. And initially, some years ago, about 5 years ago, there was a report that by observing X-ray emission from clusters of galaxies, one is able to see a small deviation near 3.5 keV, and that was attributed to a possible decay of dark matter. This is a result which is still to be fully confirmed, and one doesn't know whether this actually exists or not, but it would be fascinating to find such a thing if such a signature actually does exist. And that will tell us clearly about what the dark matter may be composed of. And this is a picture of the gamma ray emission of the whole sky, from the whole sky. And most of this gamma ray emission that you see comes from the plane of our own galaxy, which is in the mid plane over here. This diagram is plotted in galactic coordinates. And most of that emission is cosmic rays, which is high energy nuclides radiating, interacting with gas and producing pions, which then decay to produce 2 photons and the 2 gamma ray photons. And these gamma ray photons are what constitute most of the diffuse emission that we see. So finally, I will end by mentioning some collective emission processes. So far, what we have been talking about, individual particles radiating because of their acceleration, or individual particles undergoing either nuclear scattering or radioactive decay and producing emission. But there are also collective processes by which some disturbance in a medium causes a collective motion of the electrons or the charges in it. And it is this collective motion of the charges which then produce some radiation that we can actually observe. One such process is called Cherenkov emission, where charged particle, highly energetic charged particle, enters a medium, and the charged particle is so energetic is that in that medium, it is moving faster than the speed of light in that medium. If such a thing happens, then it leaves a kind of shockwave-like wake behind it of interaction, and all the charged particles which have been disturbed by this motion act collectively and produce a radiation called Cherenkov emission. This is a superluminal charged particle in a medium produces Cherenkov emission, and this Cherenkov radiation created in our atmosphere by impact of high energy cosmic ray charged particles is used to detect not only cosmic ray particles, but also high energy gamma ray photons. So the high energy gamma ray photon interacts with the atmosphere and produces high energy charged particles, and these high energy charged particles then move through the air and produce Cherenkov emission. And using Cherenkov telescopes, one is able to observe gamma rays coming from astronomical sources at tera electron volt and peta electron volt energies. The other collective emission processes include plasma waves. So you can take a plasma and then perturb it, and there could be a collective charge density wave which is propagating in a plasma, and on encountering a discontinuity or inhomogeneity, some of that wave energy can convert to electromagnetic radiation. So, plasma waves can give rise to electromagnetic radiation when converted in some discontinuity or density gradient or inhomogeneity or magnetic field. Or you can have maser emission, for example, cyclotron maser emission, where collectively a large number of particles undergo stimulated cyclotron scattering from a higher cyclotron state to a lower cyclotron state. And the cyclotron maser emission can be very, very bright, particularly at radio wavelengths, and seen in planetary aurorae. Jupiter is a tremendous source of radio emission, and most of the radio emission comes due to the cyclotron resonance in Jupiter's magnetic atmosphere. The Earth itself is a strong source of radio emission. The Earth's aurora produces a strong source of radio emission at the frequency characteristic of it. So there are planets, brown dwarfs, low mass stars, pulsar magnetospheres, jets, where cyclotron maser emission could be very important. So that is all. I will stop here, and I will conclude my lecture on radiative processes. Thank you very much.
Hello, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
So I just had this question that say if situation occurs that from a galaxy we have several processes of emission from which we are getting the emission of several processes at nearly the same frequency range, then is there any way to distinguish these processes from the obtained data?
Yeah, you can look at the shape of the spectrum. Often we do that. We see combined emission, and then we try to decompose it, knowing what the spectral shape of individual processes will be like, and then try to see what is the relative importance of different processes that contribute to this emission. So you'll have to do, you have to make sufficient number of measurements so that enough spectral points are present. And using that, you try to do a combined fit of your model where all the expected emission processes are present, and then determine the model parameters which will give you the relative importance of these processes.
Okay, thank you.
Dipankar, there was a question in the chat about multiple peaks in the H1 emission profile.
So you see multiple peaks, valleys, and so on, right? Now, each of these, wherever intense emission is there, corresponds to a certain concentration of hydrogen gas. Now, what this shows is that these concentrations of hydrogen gas are located at different velocities with respect to us. And because of that, the Doppler shift is different. So this whole spread of this emission here is because of the Doppler shift of different pieces of gas being different, right? Now, in this case, this is the neutral hydrogen H1 21 centimeter profile through the gas distribution in our own galaxy at a galactic longitude of 45 degrees right through the galactic plane. So if you take that line of sight, you have gas sitting at different distances with respect to us, and the galaxy is in differential rotation. So the gas at different distances from us will appear at different relative velocity with respect to us. And wherever there is a concentration of gas, the corresponding relative velocity will be highlighted in this H1 profile. So in fact, you can then work back and then map the distances to these gas concentrations using the rotation profile of our galaxy. So basically, what this profile is showing is that the gas is distributed in clumps at different distances from us, and each of these different distances have a different relative velocity with respect to us.
Okay, so I mean the dual agent systems will also show similar signature, right? Regarding the Doppler shift, means from the profile we can know whether it's a dual agent or.
Yeah, so if you are seeing H1 from the AGN, of course, I'm not sure you see H1 from each of these AGNs, but if you can find a spectral line which you can see from both components, then you should be able to see it.
Okay. I guess it's the OH line we observe from the AGNs.
Okay. Yeah.
Dipankar, there is another question on the web, which is how do we distinguish between synchrotron and curvature radiation from observed data, as both of them have similar properties? Is it with spectral profiling only?
Yeah, well, they have similar properties, that is correct, in terms of total spectrum, but it is also dependent on the context, because if you take pulsar magnetosphere and you ask what would be the synchrotron frequency. So let's take the pulsar magnetosphere. We know the pulsar has a magnetic field of the order of a teragauss. Now, if you take a synchrotron frequency, let's take even the cyclotron frequency, right, where gamma is equal to 1. I have mentioned to you that cyclotron frequency is 3 megahertz per Gauss, right? In 10 to the power of 12 Gauss, that will be 3 times 10 to the power of 18 hertz, which is in X-rays. So we, in fact, it will be 12 kilo electron volts for 10 to the power of 12 Gauss. On the other hand, I see a power law radiation spectrum in radio band. Clearly, synchrotron radiation from this 10 to the 12 Gauss magnetic field by electrons will not be able to produce radio frequencies. On the other hand, the curvature of the magnetic field is gentle, and that has just the right value of radius of curvature to produce radio emission. So we also have to supply some of this context information to make sure that we are identifying the right radiation process.